The day after my husband died, I reached for the closet keys. My own son ripped them from my hand and told me to leave. That was the moment I stopped being quiet. If you're new to my channel, please subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. My name is Margaret Carter. I am 68 years old and I live in a quiet town just outside Columbus, Ohio. Until very recently, I was a wife for 46 years. I was also a mother, the kind who stayed behind the scenes making sure everyone else stood comfortably in the light. I never imagined that after burying my husband, I would be treated like a stranger in the very home we built together. Before everything fell apart, my life was simple. Not easy but steady. I woke up early, made the coffee, kept the house running, and handled the details no one else wanted to think about. I paid the bills, organized the paperwork, and knew exactly which drawer held what. My husband trusted me with everything, even when others assumed I was just helping. I never asked for recognition. I believed love was enough. My son used to call me every Sunday without fail. He leaned on me more than he ever admitted out loud. When his marriage struggled, I listened without judging. When money was tight, I helped quietly and never mentioned it again. I didn't keep score. I didn't remind him of what I'd done. I thought that kind of loyalty mattered. When my husband got sick, I became his constant. I stayed up through nights that felt endless. I learned medical terms I never wanted to know. I memorized medication schedules. I held his hand when his strength faded and told him he wasn't alone, even when I was terrified myself. During those months, I saw fear in my son's eyes, but I also saw something else. Impatience. A restlessness that made me uneasy. I ignored it. I told myself grief makes people act in ways they don't understand. The morning after the funeral, the house felt hollow. Friends had gone home. The casseroles sat untouched in the refrigerator. Every sound echoed, too loud, too sharp. I wasn't ready to change anything. I wasn't ready to let go. I just wanted one thing. One small piece of my husband to hold on to. The closet had always been his space. He kept it locked, not because he was secretive but out of habit. Important papers. Old jackets. Things he wanted kept safe. We both knew what was inside. We always had. I reached for the keys with trembling hands. That's when my son appeared behind me. He didn't ask what I was doing. He didn't ask if I was okay. He grabbed my wrist and pulled the keys away as if I had crossed some invisible line. "You don't have any right to that," he said. I turned toward him, confused, still numb from grief. I told him I just wanted one of his father's scarves. Something familiar. Something that still smelled like home. "That's my father's stuff," he snapped. "Not yours. You need to back off. Actually, you should leave." Those words hit harder than the dirt hitting the coffin the day before. My daughter-in-law stood nearby with her arms folded, watching. She didn't stop him. She didn't look away. Her silence wasn't neutral. It felt deliberate, like permission. I didn't scream. I didn't argue. I stood there empty-handed while my son walked away, the keys heavy in his pocket. In that moment, something painful became clear. My role had already been decided for me and respect was no longer part of it. That night, alone in the small guest room they had suggested I use for now, I lay staring at the ceiling. I replayed every detail, the grip on my wrist, his tone, the way no one stepped in. No one defended me. Grief broke my heart. Humiliation sharpened it. They thought my silence meant weakness. They believed age had dulled me. What they didn't realize was that I had spent a lifetime paying attention, remembering details, and preparing quietly while no one was watching. And that was the night I decided I would never beg for my place again. After that night, memories began returning to me in fragments, as if my mind was quietly reminding me who I had been before they reduced me to an inconvenience. I had not always felt small in that house. For most of my life, I had been the center that held everything together even when no one acknowledged it. I was 68 years old, but I didn't feel old inside. I had raised my son with patience and discipline. I taught him right from wrong, taught him to respect his father, and taught him that family meant responsibility, not entitlement. When he was young, he followed me from room to room, asking questions, watching how I handled things. I was the one he ran to when he was scared. I was the one who steadied him when his temper flared and the world felt overwhelming. My husband saw that strength in me. He depended on it. We were partners in every sense of the word. He faced the outside world and I managed everything that kept our home standing. Decisions were never one-sided. Even when my name wasn't spoken aloud, My voice was always present. He trusted my judgment without question because he knew how carefully I thought things through. When my son married, the changes came quietly. Not overnight. Not with arguments or announcements. Just subtle shifts that were easy to excuse. Conversations happened without me. Plans were made and later explained as if my role was simply to be informed. I noticed, but I told myself it was normal. Families evolve. Children grow up. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clung too tightly. My daughter-in-law was polite on the surface. She smiled, said thank you, and corrected me gently when I offered advice she hadn't asked for. But there was always a distance in her eyes. Calculating look. As if she was constantly deciding where I fit and how much space I was allowed to take. So I stayed in my place. I didn't interfere. I didn't complain. I believed that if I remained steady, if I stayed kind and patient, things would eventually balance themselves out. I thought time would smooth everything. When my husband's health began to fail, I became invisible in a different way. Doctors spoke to my son instead of me, even when I was the one sitting by the bed every night. Decisions were explained to him, not discussed with me. I let it happen. I was too focused on keeping my husband comfortable to fight for recognition or control. After his death, that invisibility turned colder. No one asked how I was coping. No one asked what I needed. Decisions were made quickly and confidently without my input. It was as if my grief disqualified me from having a voice. What hurt most wasn't just the loss of control. It was how easily they took it. My son began speaking to me as if I were confused. As if I no longer understood my own life. He used phrases like, "for your own good," and "you don't need to worry about this anymore." Each sentence pushed me further out, gently but firmly. That's when I realized something painful. They didn't see me as a woman who had lived a full life. They saw me as a problem to manage. What they didn't know, what no one ever bothered to ask, was how much I understood. I had been the one filing documents, reading contracts, organizing records, and paying attention for decades. I knew how things worked because I had made them work. I wasn't loud. I wasn't confrontational. I had learned long ago that real power doesn't announce itself. And as I sat there replaying my son's voice in my mind, I understood something with aching clarity. They believed my story was finished. They were wrong. Before everything unraveled, my days moved to a rhythm I had built over decades. I woke up early even when there was no reason to. Old habits don't leave you easily. I made the coffee the way my husband liked it long after he stopped drinking it. I kept the house in order, the mail neatly stacked, the calendar updated. Those routines grounded me. They reminded me that I still mattered, that I still had a place in the world. I wasn't treated badly outright, not at first. It was quieter than that. I was overlooked. Conversations slowed or stopped when I entered the room. Decisions were announced, not discussed. If I offered an opinion, it was met with a polite nod and then set aside as if I had spoken into empty space. My son began speaking for me, correcting me in front of others. If I explained something, he would interrupt and rephrase it like my words needed translating. I told myself it was stress. Grief. The weight of responsibility. I made excuses for him because that's what mothers do. We soften the edges for our children even when it costs us something. My daughter-in-law started rearranging things without asking. Cabinets were changed. Papers were moved. She referred to the house as ours, in a way that quietly excluded me. When friends called, she answered. When mail arrived, she sorted it before I could see it. I noticed all of it, but I didn't challenge her. I didn't want conflict. I convinced myself that peace was worth the discomfort. There were moments that should have warned me. One afternoon, I couldn't find an important envelope I had left on the desk. When I asked about it, my son told me not to worry, that he had taken care of it. He didn't explain what that meant. He didn't need to. The message was clear. I no longer needed to know. Another time, I overheard them discussing plans for the house while I was in the next room. My name wasn't mentioned once. When I stepped into the doorway, the conversation stopped. My daughter-in-law smiled and said, "We'll explain later." Later never came. Slowly, I began to feel like a guest in my own life. So I stayed quiet. I was grieving. I didn't trust my emotions. I was afraid that if I spoke up, they would label me difficult or worse, unstable. I had seen how easily people dismiss older women, especially grieving ones. I didn't want to give them that excuse. So I watched. I listened. I remembered. I noticed which drawers were suddenly locked. Which folders were moved? Which questions were left unanswered? I noticed how my son's confidence grew with every boundary he crossed. Confidence built on the belief that I wouldn't push back. He underestimated my patience. He mistook restraint for surrender. Every night I sat alone and thought about the years I had spent holding everything together. I thought about the agreements my husband and I had made in private, long before illness took his strength. I thought about the trust he placed in me, not because I demanded it but because I earned it. That trust hadn't died with him. They believed they were slowly easing me out step by step. They thought I wouldn't notice. Or worse, that I would notice and still do nothing. They were wrong. Because while they were busy deciding my future without me, I was beginning to understand something I could no longer ignore. Silence had protected me once. But now it was time to choose differently. And I was closer to that choice than they realized. The betrayal didn't arrive all at once. It slipped in quietly, wrapped in grief and routine, disguised as concern. By the time I fully understood what was happening, it had already settled into the way they looked at me, like I was something delicate that needed to be managed, not respected. The morning it happened, the house was unnaturally quiet. My daughter-in-law had taken the day off work. My son was home too, moving through the rooms with a focus that made my chest tighten. They weren't whispering, but they weren't including me either. It felt as though decisions had already been made and I had already been excluded. I stood in front of the bedroom closet because it felt familiar. Because it was one of the few places where my marriage still felt intact. The lock had always been there and the keys had always been kept in the same spot. I reached for them without thinking. My hands were shaking, not from fear but from sheer exhaustion. I didn't even get the door open. My son came up behind me so quickly I barely had time to turn. His grip closed around my wrist. Firm, impatient. He yanked the keys away and stepped between me and the closet as if I were trespassing in my own life. "You can't go in there," he said. I stared at him, waiting for an explanation. Waiting for something that would make sense of what was happening. Instead, he looked past me toward my daughter-in-law as if checking for approval before continuing. "That's my father's stuff," he said. "You don't have any claim to it." The words didn't land at first. They felt unreal. I asked him what he meant. I told him I just wanted one of his jackets. Something small. Something familiar to hold on to. He didn't soften. He didn't hesitate. "You need to stop," he said. "You don't get to make decisions anymore. And honestly, you should start packing. This house, it's time." Heat rushed to my face, not anger but shame. The kind that makes your ears ring and your throat close. I looked around the room, hoping someone would step in. My daughter-in-law stood a few feet away, arms crossed, watching with an expression that felt rehearsed. She didn't defend me. She didn't look uneasy. She looked relieved. That was when I understood this wasn't really about the closet. It wasn't even about my husband's belongings. It was about control. About removing me from the center of the story and placing themselves there instead. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed but because I needed time. I needed space to breathe. I let my son walk away with the keys. I let them believe they had taken something from me. Inside, something else was happening. As there was grief. But beneath it was something steadier. A quiet awareness that this moment mattered. That how I responded, not right then but later, would shape everything that came next. They thought they had pushed me aside. What they didn't understand was that they had just shown me exactly who they were. And once you see that clearly, you stop doubting yourself. That night, the house felt smaller than it ever had. The walls seemed closer, the air heavier, as if the space itself was closing in on me. I shut the door to the guest room they had placed me in and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the light. From there, I could hear them moving through the house. Drawers opening, doors closing, voices lowered. Every time I stepped into the hallway, the voices stopped. I felt like a shadow drifting through my own life. Grief carries its own weight, but what settled on me that night was something sharper. It was the pain of being erased. Of realizing that the years I had poured into my marriage, my home, my child were already being rewritten without me. As if my purpose had ended the moment my husband took his last breath. I replayed the scene at the closet again and again. The way my son's hand closed around my wrist. The certainty in his voice. The fact that he didn't hesitate for even a second. That hurt more than his words. It told me he had already decided who I was now, and how little I mattered. I wondered how long this had been building. How many conversations had happened behind closed doors. How many decisions had already been made without me? I thought about every time I stayed quiet to keep the peace, every moment I chose patience over confrontation. I had believed kindness would come back to me, that loyalty would be remembered. Instead, it had been mistaken for weakness. I lay awake until morning, staring at the ceiling, asking myself the same questions over and over. Should I speak up? Should I push back now while everything was still raw? Or should I remain silent like I always had and hope time would soften their behavior? Then a deeper fear settled in. Not fear of them, but fear of vanishing. Fear that if I let this moment pass without resistance, I would spend the rest of my life asking permission to exist in rooms I once ruled. I thought about my husband. About the quiet conversations we had late at night when the house was still. About how careful he was with plans, how deliberate with decisions. He used to tell me that security wasn't about money. It was about knowing exactly where you stand. In that moment, I knew precisely where I stood in my son's eyes. By morning, my sadness had shifted into something steadier. I made myself coffee and sat at the kitchen table while the house slept. My hands no longer shook. My thoughts slowed, becoming clear and deliberate. I realized I didn't need to raise my voice to be heard. I didn't need to argue or beg. What I needed was clarity. And time. They believed I was alone, overwhelmed, uncertain. They believed grief had broken me. What they couldn't see was that grief had stripped away my doubts. It had revealed one simple truth. I could no longer depend on their kindness. I had to depend on myself. I gathered my thoughts carefully, the same way I had done for years while solving other people's problems. Only this time it was for my own survival. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I was done being passive. And that quiet, unseen decision was the moment everything began to change. The days that followed blurred together in a way that frightened me. Grief does that. It softens the edges of time until hours and days lose their shape. But humiliation sharpens everything again. Every small interaction reminded me exactly where I stood now. They spoke around me, never to me. Plans were made at the kitchen counter while I sat at the table, close enough to hear every word, yet clearly excluded. When I asked a question, my son answered without meeting my eyes. When I lingered in a room, my daughter-in-law found a reason to change the subject or step away, as if my presence alone was inconvenient. I began eating alone. At night, I lay awake listening to the house settle, the creak of floors, the hum of appliances, wondering how something so familiar could suddenly feel so hostile. I questioned myself constantly. Was I imagining this? Was grief distorting my judgment? I had been taught my whole life to doubt my reactions, to smooth things over, to avoid being seen as difficult. But the loneliness was real. I missed my husband more during those days than I had at the funeral. When he was alive, I always had a witness. Someone who saw me, who understood my worth without needing it explained. Without him, I felt exposed. Vulnerable in a way I hadn't expected and hadn't prepared for. There were moments when I nearly spoke up. When the words rose right to the back of my throat. But fear stopped me, not fear of them, but fear of how they would describe me. That I was unstable. Emotional. Confused. I had seen how quickly those labels were placed on older women, especially widows, and how hard they were to shake once attached. So I stayed quiet. That silence carried a cost. It crept into my thoughts, shrinking me little by little. I began second-guessing memories I knew were true. I caught myself apologizing for things I hadn't done, softening my voice out of habit. I hated that about myself, but at the time I didn't know how to stop it. One afternoon I overheard my son on the phone. He was talking about handling things and making sure everything was secured. He mentioned my name once casually, like an item on a list. In that moment, I understood that my life was being discussed as a problem to manage, not a person to consider. That was when the confusion finally lifted. I wasn't powerless. I was being treated that way. There's a difference. Once I understood that, the pain shifted. It didn't vanish, but it changed shape. It became something solid, something I could work with. I began writing things down, not emotionally, just facts. Dates. Conversations. Movements. I reminded myself of what I knew, what I had done, what I had always been responsible for. I stopped sharing my thoughts with them. I stopped trying to explain myself. I conserved my energy the way you do when you know a long journey is ahead and you can't afford to waste strife. They mistook my quiet for acceptance. But inside, something steady was taking hold. A resolve that didn't need approval. A clarity that didn't ask permission. I was still grieving, still hurting, still lonely, but I was no longer lost. And once you find yourself again, even quietly, the balance of power begins to shift. There was something they never asked me about. Something they assumed I didn't understand or had forgotten, or had never paid attention to in the first place. That assumption turned out to be their greatest mistake. For years, I had handled the paperwork in my marriage. Not because my husband was careless, but because he trusted me completely. I organized the files, kept copies, and knew which documents mattered and which didn't. When decisions were made, I listened closely. When plans were discussed, I remembered every detail. I never felt the need to announce that knowledge. It was simply part of who I was. What my son and daughter-in-law didn't know was that my husband and I had prepared for moments like this long before illness entered our lives. Not out of fear, but out of responsibility. We talked openly about what would happen if one of us was gone. We agreed on protections, on boundaries, on fairness. We planned carefully, the way people do when they understand that love alone is not a safeguard. Those conversations stayed with me, clear and untouched by time. I didn't rush. I didn't confront anyone. I waited. I let them grow comfortable in their assumptions. I let them believe the keys meant control. While they relaxed, thinking the situation was settled, I quietly began putting things in order. I made phone calls from my car so no one could overhear me. I scheduled appointments during hours they assumed I was resting or unavailable. I located documents I had placed years earlier, in places only I would remember. I reread pages I had once skimmed, this time with full attention and a clear purpose. Each piece of paper steadied me. Each confirmation grounded me further. They reminded me that I wasn't imagining anything, that my memory was sharp, that my understanding was real, and most importantly that my husband had not left me unprotected. I wasn't doing this out of revenge. That surprised me. I wasn't fueled by anger. I was guided by survival, by dignity, by the simple determination to make sure I would not be erased quietly. As the days passed, I noticed a shift in myself. I stopped flinching when my son raised his voice. I stopped shrinking when my daughter-in-law dismissed me. I listened. I nodded. Kept my thoughts private. They saw my calm and mistook it for defeat. What they couldn't see was what was forming beneath the surface. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. Not dramatically. Not emotionally. Methodically. During that time, I understood something I had always known but never needed before. Strength doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it gathers information. Sometimes it allows others to reveal exactly how far they're willing to go. And the more they assumed I was no longer part of the picture, the easier it became for me to move without resistance. By the time they realized I was no longer confused, no longer dependent, no longer afraid, it would already be too late. As I had everything I needed. And soon I would decide how to use it. The turning point didn't arrive with anger or tears. It came quietly on an ordinary afternoon, when I realized I was done waiting for permission to exist in my own life. I was sitting alone in my car, parked a few blocks away from the house, a folder resting in my lap. Inside were copies of documents I had already reviewed more than once. I had checked every detail carefully, not rushing, not assuming anything. I wanted certainty before I moved forward. And in that moment I had it. For the first time since my husband died, I felt steady. I understood something with absolute clarity. If I kept trying to explain myself to my son, he would only hear weakness. If I pleaded, he would take it as proof that he was right to take control. That realization was sobering and freeing. So I made a decision I had never made before. I stopped explaining. That same afternoon I contacted a lawyer. Not dramatically. Not in a rush of panic. Calmly and deliberately. I chose someone local, someone who spoke plainly and listened carefully. I didn't tell my son. I didn't tell my daughter-in-law. I didn't owe them access to this part of my life anymore. During that first meeting I didn't cry. I didn't dramatize anything. I laid out facts, dates, agreements, conversations. What had been said. What had been taken. What had been implied without ever being spoken aloud. The lawyer listened without interrupting, without reacting. When I finished, he nodded slowly. He didn't look surprised. That alone told me more than words could. Over the next few days I gathered what I needed. Documents my husband and I had discussed years earlier. Records that showed my role clearly and unmistakably. Proof that I hadn't imagined my place in that marriage or in that home. With each step, something inside me grew stronger. I wasn't acting out of spite. I wasn't trying to punish anyone. I was reclaiming my footing, quietly, carefully on my own terms. At home I said nothing. I let my son continue speaking to me as if I were unsure. I let my daughter-in-law watch me like I was fading away. Their confidence grew. They believed the hardest part was already behind them. They were wrong. The moment I chose action over silence, everything shifted. I no longer felt trapped. I felt prepared. And preparation changes the way you carry yourself. It changes how you look at people who believe they've already won. I wasn't afraid of the confrontation anymore. I was ready for it. The confrontation didn't happen the way they expected. There was no shouting, no dramatic entrance. It unfolded on a quiet Saturday afternoon, when my son suggested we all sit down and talk things through. He said it gently, almost kindly, as if he were doing me a favor. We sat at the dining table, the same table where I had served meals for decades. My son took the seat at the head without hesitation. My daughter-in-law sat beside him. I noticed how natural that position seemed to him now, how ownership had already settled into his posture, as if the place had always belonged to him. He started by explaining what he believed was best for everyone. He spoke about managing assets and making practical decisions. His tone was slow and deliberate, the way people speak when they think the other person might not fully understand. He said they were only trying to protect me. I let him finish. Then I placed my folder on the table. The room changed instantly. Not because of anything I said, but because of what I didn't say. I didn't challenge his version of events. I didn't interrupt or defend myself. I simply opened the folder and slid a document toward the center of the table. My son frowned, clearly confused. My daughter-in-law leaned forward despite herself. I told them calmly that I had spoken to a lawyer. I told them I understood exactly what my rights were. I explained that the closet they had locked me out of held more than personal belongings. It contained documents my husband and I had prepared together. Documents that clearly defined ownership, authority, and protection. I watched my son's face change as he read. The confidence he had carried so easily began to drain away, replaced by something closer to fear. My daughter-in-law's smile vanished completely. She didn't interrupt. She couldn't. I explained that taking the keys without my consent had consequences. That excluding me from decisions did not erase my legal standing. That moving me into a guest room did not make me a guest. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost physical. For the first time since my husband's death, I was the one setting the terms. I wasn't raising my voice. I wasn't emotional. I was precise. And clarity has a way of cutting straight through denial. My son tried to speak, but his words came out scattered. He accused me of misunderstanding, of overreacting. I didn't engage with any of it. I simply told him that everything from that point forward would be handled through proper channels. That was when it finally sank in. They had mistaken patience for confusion, grief for weakness, silence for surrender. I stood up slowly from the table. I told them the conversation was over for now, that I would be staying, and that things would proceed correctly whether they approved or not. As I walked away, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt free. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded steadily, the way real accountability always does, quietly, legally, and without any room to escape. Within days, the atmosphere in the house shifted. My son stopped issuing instructions and began asking careful questions instead. My daughter-in-law avoided me completely. Doors closed more softly. Voices lowered when I entered a room. The confidence they had worn so easily before began to slip, replaced by uncertainty. Letters started arriving. Phone calls were returned. Appointments were scheduled without consulting them. They realized they no longer controlled the process. The lawyer handled everything with calm efficiency, leaving no space for manipulation. Ownership was clarified. Authority was defined. Boundaries were placed into writing where emotions could no longer twist them. What my son had assumed was his to manage turned out to be far more complex, and far less forgiving, than he expected. At first he was furious. Not openly. That would have required accountability. Instead, his anger showed itself as resentment. Distance. He accused me of making things unnecessarily difficult. He said I was tearing the family apart. I listened. I didn't defend myself. Because by then I understood something clearly. People who benefit from your silence will always resent your voice. The financial reality hit them harder than they had planned for. Decisions they had quietly made without me had to be undone. Plans they thought were final had to be reconsidered. The illusion of control they clung to dissolved under documentation and law. The shift in power was unmistakable. For the first time since my husband died, I slept through the night. I wasn't bracing myself for the next insult or dismissal. I wasn't wondering what was being decided behind my back. The uncertainty that had followed me for weeks disappeared, replaced by structure and clarity. They didn't apologize. I never expected them to. Instead, there was distance. A careful politeness that almost resembled respect. Not because they suddenly understood my pain, but because they finally understood my position. That was enough. I didn't take pleasure in their discomfort. I didn't celebrate their shock. I simply held my ground and allowed the truth to do its work. I didn't need revenge. I needed balance. I needed my life returned to me. And slowly, piece by piece, it was. The house felt like mine again. Not because I had won an argument, but because I had reclaimed my place within it. I no longer asked permission to sit at my own table. I no longer waited for approval to speak. They had learned something they could never unlearn. I was not powerless. And I was not leaving. The house didn't change overnight, but I did. And that was the real victory. I secured what I needed: my home, my finances, my independence. Not through arguments or raised voices, but through clarity. Through patience. Through a refusal to disappear simply because it was convenient for someone else. I no longer slept in the guest room. I moved back into my bedroom. I opened the closet whenever I wanted. I touched my husband's things without asking permission from anyone. My son stopped telling me what was best for me. He didn't suddenly become gentle or apologetic, but he became careful. That change told me everything I needed to know. Respect didn't come from regret. It came from boundaries that could no longer be crossed. My daughter-in-law kept her distance. There were no warm conversations, no attempts to repair what had been broken. And I accepted that. I wasn't searching for affection anymore. I was protecting my peace. I learned how to sit with my grief without letting it hollow me out. I learned that mourning a husband does not mean surrendering your life. I learned that silence can be a choice, but it should never be something imposed on you. What hurt the most wasn't losing my husband. It was losing the version of myself who believed love alone was enough to keep me safe. But in losing that illusion, I gained something stronger: self-respect that no one could strip away. If there is one thing I want you to understand, it's this: age does not make you fragile. Experience makes you formidable in the quietest way. We notice patterns others miss. We remember details others overlook. We endure things that would break people who never had to learn patience. I don't regret waiting. I don't regret staying calm. I regret only one thing: that I ever believed my worth depended on how gently others treated me. I am still grieving. I always will be. But I am also standing. And if you're listening to this and feeling invisible, dismissed, or pushed aside, especially because of your age, know this: your strength didn't fade with time. It deepened. Mine did. And it carried me all the way back to myself. Looking back now, I understand that the hardest part wasn't losing my husband. It was realizing how quickly people can rewrite your place in their lives once they decide you no longer matter. Grief opened my eyes, but experience taught me how to respond. I learned that dignity is not something others hand to you. Something you protect. For years, I believed that keeping the peace meant I was being respected. I was wrong. Peace without respect is just quiet harm endured in silence. What surprised me most was my own strength. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten anyone. I didn't rush to prove myself. I waited. I watched. And I acted when the moment was right. That patience, earned over decades, carried me through. Age didn't slow me down. Sharpen me. My son never apologized. My daughter-in-law never admitted what she did. I had to accept that closure doesn't always arrive in the form of regret from others. Sometimes it comes from standing firmly where you belong and refusing to be moved again. I reclaimed my life one boundary at a time. I learned to trust my judgment again. I learned that love does not require erasing yourself, and that family does not earn the right to humiliate you simply because you are older or grieving. If there is one message I want to leave you with, it's this: never confuse quiet with weakness. Some of the strongest decisions are made in silence. Some of the most powerful victories don't need witnesses. I am an elderly woman, yes. But I am also capable, aware, and unbreakable in ways I didn't fully understand until I was tested. I survived not by becoming someone new, but by finally honoring who I had always been. My story didn't end when my husband died. It began again the moment I chose myself. If this story touched you, please remember this. You are never too old, too quiet, or too tired to stand up for yourself. Your life, your dignity, and your boundaries still matter. Thank you for listening to my story until the end. If you felt my strength, subscribe to the channel and share this story with someone who might need it today. And before you go, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Your support reminds me that even after betrayal, we are never truly alone.